Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Mark Lomax II, 2019 resident artist at the Wex and composer of 400 in African Epic. And I'm here with Dr. Melissa Kromm, who worked with me on the project and developed the 400 curriculum guide that I think, especially now, is a really valuable tool for everyone, but specifically students K-12, to help understand the historic context of the social and political unrest that we're seeing behind all of the police brutality and general instances of structural institutional racism in America. And is really a focus of my artistic work. And so today we're going to talk about how the art and the educational aspect go hand in hand. Hi, Melissa.
Hello, Mark. Great to be here. I'm Dr. Melissa Kromm with Mosaic Education Network and Mosaic Education Press. And I was really excited that Mark asked me to support him in creating um, something to accompany his sonic journey through history. I was able to also work with Deva Rashed-Boone, who assisted me, who is an educator and also a great writer as well. So I was glad we were able to work together. What my, I guess, day job often is not just creating curriculum, but creating spaces for people to be thinking about how they're experiencing the world, or if there's parts of the world that they're not experiencing, and how they can connect their everyday understanding or even misunderstandings to larger institutions and systems. And so 400 in African Epic gave me an opportunity to write down some of these connections along with how we can be thinking through that sonically as well. So I'm glad that we were able to team up.
Yes, so that's a great segue. 400 in African Epic, for those who don't know, is a 12 album, 8.5 hour composition or cycle that really goes through thousands of years of history. That is pre-colonial African history in the first third, the Ma'afa, or Great Tragedy, which is 1619, the date when the first 29 Negroes were brought to North America as enslaved Africans from present-day Angola to the present, and then an artistic projection of what the future will look like in the final third. And from the beginning, I knew that the good thing about music, especially music without lyrics, is that you can write about anything and convey any sort of sentiment in very complex ways. But the bad thing about music is that you can write about anything and convey any sentiment in very complex ways. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the listener really understands the intent, artistically or otherwise, of the composer. And so with a project this vast in terms of historic context and timelines, and this connected to 2019, which was the 400th commemoration of those first 29 Negroes landing in North America, I wanted to make sure that we had a tool that would facilitate conversation and deeper thinking and understanding of the context in which the work is being created. And I honestly originally intended only to write a 3-movement symphony, past, present, and future being the movements. It turned into 12 albums. And I thought I was going to write the curriculum too. And I was like, I just don't have time. I can't do it. So the only person I could trust to develop something that I thought would be as excellent as I felt the music work was you, Melissa. And so I thank you for, a beautiful piece of work. I mean, I think we had 2 or 3 conversations, and I sent you a bunch of my notes, and then you did your thing. So will you tell me about the process? Because I feel like to a certain extent, your process in creating the curriculum mirrors the process that I underwent in composing the piece.
Yeah, so It was a longer process than I thought it was going to be. Because it was, I realized, so me and Deva had a similar response, which was my African American African Studies degree relied heavily on the African American part and not the African part. And so although I was exposed to Dogon and was exposed to Kemet and exposed to the different ancient civilizations, to really dig into the cosmology and really dig into that history, it became a learning experience for me. And so I was really excited to be able to get the opportunity to start thinking about what do I need to learn and unlearn myself? And then how can I write that in a way that becomes approachable? Because I think for educators, many educators know that, okay, what I've been doing so far is it's barely the tip of the iceberg when we're looking at different experiences and histories, et cetera. I don't even know where to start. And I've had so many educators say, like, where do I even begin? And so I like to tell folks that this is a ways to kind of hit like the big areas. And we don't even get to all of them. We don't get to Songhai. We don't get to like a host of other spaces. And so it's like, these are just like some of the greatest hits. Like it's not even all until it becomes a starter. So even in that, like being able to think through, how do I even pick and choose of the things you were thinking about? How do I break that down into 4 lessons? And so really mirroring your framework around constructing the movement and thinking about what makes sense here for someone who's started, and then how can I kind of direct them in a path to continue this learning experience? Because you called it a curriculum guide for great reason, because it's guiding you on this continuous path. It's not a series of lessons. It's not telling you this is the beginning and end, this is how you're supposed to be thinking about it. And it's just like, here's some places and some people and some concepts that you might not have asked. And I also, I like to lead or educate with a series of questions. And so really thinking through, how do I craft the questions in a way that can be projects? And I was also something that you were interested in, or things that could just make you think more.
Right.
So I think you, and I'm not a musician, but even experiencing you live doing this work, even you're thinking about like, how do I experiment or help people think differently about the sound that I'm creating? Like, how do I help people think differently about experiencing music? And so the hope was that this curriculum then mirrors that in helping folks think through, how do I experience my educational journey a bit differently? How do I start to see Africans and African descendants a bit differently, or address concepts that I haven't considered before?
And by extension, themselves in that context, right? Because one of the things about this project being so massive in terms of the chronological scope is that, to your point, you can't hit everything. And so when people ask me directly, how does this piece correspond or correlate to this part of history? I say, well, it may or may not, right? It's really about abstractions that get to these larger points that then, with the appropriate line of questioning set, you can drill into on your own. And that's what I really love about the work that you and Deva did, is, it aligns, each unit aligns with the macro structure of the work, past, present, and future, right? Alkebulan, which is a word that is African derived for the continent of Africa. So it was called Kush, it was called all kind of stuff, Ethiopia, Alkebulan. So I just chose one that was not European derived. And then the middle is the Ma'afa, as we explained, and then the last section is Afrofuturism, And what you all did really well was literally line up from the abstract of the music that I was thinking to the more concrete narrative that says, okay, here's this point in history in the abstract, here's something much more concrete for you to think about history that you might not have heard about, with a lot of detail in terms of references, and then some questions for critical thought. And the reason why that was important to me in terms of moving from the abstract to the more concrete, even if we're not giving answers, is it gives the flexibility for teachers, to your point about teaching from a set of questions, to have historical context that they themselves might not have been exposed to. Use the references to get a deeper understanding and broader context so they can lead their students through an age-appropriate journey, right? So they could be listening to the African drums and drawing the continent of Africa, right, as an example. If you're in kindergarten, or if you're in high school, you know, you could be really thinking critically about feminism, womanism, with the album For Women, where every movement is named for a woman in African American history, and the role that women have played in general throughout the diaspora movement. And so those questions that you all came up with, and the context setting material, I think just, it sets the work off in a way that I couldn't have done myself or better at that. And I found it, even in the lectures I've given since we've released it, to be very, very helpful as we have conversations and go through that journey.
And I think what you said is having educators look at it and help their students on an age appropriate journey.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the best way to be thinking about it, because, like, for example, if we look at lesson 1, discussion 2, one of the question is, what does it mean to colonize knowledge? What are some examples? How does colonized knowledge connect to what we know or don't know about African history? Who benefits and who is harmed by changing the history of ancient Egypt? And so if you ask that directly to second graders, or they're like, huh?
Right.
What does that mean?
Yeah.
But we can ask, what does it mean for you not to be able to learn what you want to learn, or learn
or have it curated in a way that keeps you from asking the right question.
Right. If you're curious about something, if you want to learn more about something, but nobody made the book for you or gave you access to the book, how is that frustrating?
Mm-hmm.
Right? That could be frustrating if you want to learn more about something, but that book is not in the library, or someone told you, yes, there's a book for it, but you're not allowed to read it. And essentially, we've now helped them define colonized knowledge, right? And so it really is beholden on the educators is to be able to dig into this and be like, what of these pieces can I start to think through to make sense for my students? And it's completely possible. I believe it's completely possible. I love working with teachers. I love working with young people and helping them break down large concepts. A lot of kids understand large concepts, but you just got to give it to them in their age range.
Right.
And so,
you know, as academics and teachers, at least I was taught in music, if you can't explain this to like a 2-year-old, then you don't understand it yourself. So,
exactly.
yeah, being able to break it down that way is super important.
And I think I've been working with some K-12 teachers on thinking about what does it mean to break this up into a series of lessons, like specifically guided lessons.
Mm-hmm.
And even they are having an opportunity to learn more. They're like, well, I didn't know about this. Well, that's beautiful. So now you have all summer to figure out, like, how do you teach, like, these different concepts, right, for your age group. And I think if you're the kind of educator that is vulnerable, the kind of educator that is saying to your students, I'm learning with you, we're learning this together, which I think is the best kind of educator, then we have a real opportunity to not only arm our students with critique to be able to look at some of the traditional texts that they've been offered, but you also have an opportunity to build relationships with your students. Like, we are learning together.
And that is a form of decolonizing learning, right?
Absolutely.
You're removing the power-based, the hierarchical nature of learning and making it more communal, which is actually more African-centered in terms of learning in community, as opposed to, you know, I am telling you something and you are supposed to value it just because I told you, you know, which does not encourage critical thinking. And that's another part of this that I really love, not just the conversational approach. I'm asking a question based on this content that we've just explored. What are you thinking critically about this content? But we're guiding through helping people expand their language, right? There are definitions to words that are not common, you know, across the American lexicon. You know, people don't necessarily know what Kemet is, right? Land of the blacks, because they only know what the Greeks said, and that's Egypt or Egyptos, right? And so it's helping, even at the youngest ages, young students understand that there was a time where Africa had agency, right? And we called ourselves by ourselves. We identified based on our own destiny who we were and who we would be. And I think that's even empowering for young people to understand that they have power even at 5 or 6 to say, here's how I want to identify. You know, my kids, they're little artsy fartsy kids. And you know, my oldest, when she was 3, she said, I'm vegetarian. I'm like, how do you even know what that is?
Right.
Because she's armed with information. At 3 years old, she had enough information to make a decision about her own eating habits. And she's literally been vegetarian ever since. And my youngest daughter said, well, I like piggy bacon, but I don't like this. And I mean, those are decisions they make because we've educated them about whether or not I agree with those decisions. We've given them the option, you know, to have enough education about nutrition, as it were, to make educated decisions about how they want to move in life. And I think when you have a whole series of people or subculture of people even who historically have not been able to have that level of agency, you know, and to teach children, you know, in that K-12 space, that there was a time where these folks thought for themselves. They created whatever they wanted to create. How do you think we built the pyramids? You know, there weren't aliens, right? It was because there were thousands of years of educational processes that led to that kind of mathematic understanding that allowed them to create something that's still standing today. And I think that just opens the world for these young people critically thinking through history that they wouldn't learn otherwise.
So as we're thinking about the curriculum, how do you think, or how do you want it to change how people experience the music itself?
Oh, that's a great question. So my initial concern just about the music was that if the music was good, then it would tell the story, that you wouldn't need any supportive or supplemental materials. And then my thought was, well, if the music is that good, then maybe people would be compelled to learn more, right? And we should provide an opportunity and a vehicle through which they can access, you know, a deeper level of information. So I really do see them as kind of conjoined twins, as it were. You know, it's one of those things where I hope that the music is absolutely enjoyable on its own, but in partnership or in tangent with the curriculum, there's a more holistic experience. You know, a lot of times in art, folks, I think, get caught up in these big ideas and they forget, especially people that are African descendant, forget that our music originally, before the influence of Europe, was functional, right? There was no context of art for the sake of art. And how could I, as someone who is operating in that tradition of the jolly, or what the French call the griot, um, just create a work that is this crazy in terms of its length and magnitude, and not honor the functional aspect of traditional African music practices. And so I think the the um, the curriculum brings the function to the fore, right? Because I can't expect people who don't have familiarity with that history to just get it because I'm playing a drum set, right? But if you're listening to the drums play, or the saxophone or the strings play, and you have a tool in front of you that's guiding you through the purpose of the music and the historical context in which the music sits, then hopefully, no matter how old you are or how young you are, it allows for a deeper listening experience.
What do you think is missing, if you will? You couldn't talk about everything, but if you were to create another 400, like what was on the cutting room floor? Like, what did you wish that folks that you could have included, but it had to go?
So I didn't have budget to include more vocal components. So my dad, he's a cool dude. He's not really the most hypercritical, but he listened to the whole thing because he was driving from Columbus to Atlanta, and that's a good 8.5, 9 hours. So he got through the whole thing, and he called me. He said, "Man, this was jamming, but you left some stuff out." And I'm like, "Dad, it's like 9 hours of music." But he's right, because there are abstractions. I did not spend much time on the importance of the spiritual, right? I didn't spend much time on the various African rhythms and melodies that have deeper meaning. We tried to focus a bit on the spiritual connection between music and African culture with the Orisha and, the chant aspect of African music in the Song of the Dogon. But there's so much more there in terms of just material, right, for, some kind of artistic evolution in a contemporary context, as it were. So I left that out. But then I left a lot out in terms of, I would love to have done like portraits of individuals. That would have been really cool. And we did a little bit of that with the Four Women and Blues in August. We had portraits of Queen Nzinga, of present-day Angola, Ida B. Wells, Angela Davis, and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and August Wilson. But even in that, I mean, I had to curate 5 people, putting weight on women because, particularly in the contemporary context, the modern civil rights movement, so to speak, has been led and driven and organized and, erupted because of the work women have done. And I wanted to make sure people understood that. But that's not new either, right? Mm-hmm. Martin Luther King might have been the face, but without women driving the proverbial bus, the bus boycott in Montgomery would not have happened, right? So I wanted to make sure that those things were there. But I think, I miss people like Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer because we just didn't have time, And of the whole thing, the final version, in terms of Afrofuturism, is the shortest part because, we're not there yet. And so I would love to have been able to kind of spend more time dreaming about the future. But, that's the next piece is really, the next big piece I'm composing is about Reconstruction. So I'll be hitting you up in a year or so. Here's my research about Reconstruction in the Nader, and let's see what we could do with that, because that's something that we don't touch at all. It kind of, we glance it with album number 6, Up South, but we don't dive into that at all, and that's a whole other thing. And hopefully that'll have voice,
So there's a couple places. Reconstruction one, I think, will be interesting because unfortunately that term was never introduced to me until college.
Oh, wow.
Right? So it was like, I mean, I grew up in a small southern town, even though that doesn't actually really matter a whole lot because we, like, it shows up a lot of ways in a lot of places around the country. But I would say I wasn't in the most progressive spaces, and so it was, you know, slavery, then Lincoln, and then Martin Luther King, and then, well, we weren't at Obama yet, but now it's like Obama. It's like the end. And so I find that time so interesting because even when I introduced it to my students, it was like, well, how does people go from being on a plantation to like being in Congress? And I was like, that's not how that works, right? And so really helping people realize there's been folks who've been experiencing and learning government spaces and going to college, during this time. But I think also one thing I enjoyed kind of dipping my toe into troubling was this migration of Black people from the South to the North, which we talk a little bit about in the Unit 2. Part of it because of my own current things I'm dealing with. So right now, my grandfather passed 2 years ago, and I'm from, like I said, a small town in Florida. And my great grandmother had a lot of land. And so she just passed on her to her children. And he was like the last child to be left, but he didn't necessarily have a lot of the paperwork and stuff together before he left. And so we're dealing with like probate and stuff. And it made me start thinking like, well, why didn't they travel? Why didn't they go north? Like so many African Americans did. And really starting to think about one, wasn't necessarily beneficial to go from the South to the North for a lot of reasons. Of course, one, we already know racism was up north too. It just looked a little different. But really thinking about how Black people stayed in the South, even in the midst of the certain types of racism, because they were holding on to their assets.
Right.
They had land, right? And depending on who you are as a Black person, you may be renting out your land to other white folks, right? Who may be in a different economic situation than you. Now, you still had to tiptoe because even if they were poorer than you, they still had this kind of social power, right? That could end your life. So it was this really weird, like you have this kind of economic power, but not the social power, but so many folks weighed the pros and cons and was like, yeah, we're going to stay here. And seeing how my family was one of those folks who was just like, yeah, we're gonna stay here.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to focus on Reconstruction and the Nadir, or some folks pronounce it Nadir, Nadir, because there's a lot of conversation in the current climate about Black economic empowerment and how if only we had economic parity, then a lot of this stuff would go away. And I'm not against at all reparations of Black economic empowerment, but I feel like, I know that Reconstruction in particular is a period of American history that is not taught precisely because it was a period where you did have not just enclaves, but whole towns that were economically self-sufficient, run, operated, built by Black hands. And those most often were the people who were lynched, right? When people are talking about those respectability politics, it was likely someone from that little small town in Florida that you were from that owned a shop who was going home in a three-piece suit and a hat and a nice dress and overcoat, who represented direct economic competition to their white counterparts. And as a result of that, they were lynched, right?
Right. And it's so interesting when I have these conversations, when I do these diversity trainings with teachers and corporations and organizations and things. And I say, we're gonna have a conversation specifically around race and understanding systems of race. And then usually there'll be somebody that I will say, a white person who might say, well, I don't have a white privilege because I grew up poor.
Mm-hmm.
And I say, and that is when we have, it's so interesting how we kind of overlap, so many people overlap this kind of class and race,
Right,
and
right.
not realizing the difference. And when we talk about things like having affluent Black people who are being lynched by poor white people,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so being able to say, this right here is a race issue, right? Because even though we've had some ways in which we're able to go up in class, my class doesn't keep me from being
Right.
killed, right?
Right.
And so now we're looking at that in things like police brutality,
Trayvon
right?
Martin. Even.
Trayvon Martin
Right.
with Zimmerman, right?
His
You have
family
folks,
was middle class, upper middle class.
families upper middle class. You have police officers who have a variety of different incomes, but we'll put them in like your middle class or working class, whatever it might be. But still, like, it doesn't matter that I may make more than this police officer. Like, that's not going to keep me from being harmed, right? And so helping folks realize you may have been poor, and poverty sucks for everybody. That's not a great place to be. But were you poor because you were white?
Right.
Which is a
Right.
different
That's
kind of
not the case.
conversation. Right. And that's not the case. You may have been in poverty for a host of other reasons, right? But that's when we have that conversation, a conversation around capitalism, a conversation around like other forms of oppression. But if we're talking about race, we have to be real clear about what we are meaning here and what we're not meaning. And just the hope is that the curriculum and pushing people to be thinking about these things so we can be real clear about what we mean and what we don't mean, so we don't conflate the conversation and then lose what we're trying to explain.
Yeah, I hear that. And to that point, a lot of people, when they ask me who we wrote the curriculum for, who we designed it for, I really do say everyone, because it is more of that kinetic, or what, European culture has called Socratic method. Well, he would learn that in ancient Kemet, right? There's a African proverb that says, I'm paraphrasing, that you can't teach, you can only help the student discover within the knowledge, right? And that's why we ask the questions once we've set the context. So they look at me crazy, like, oh, it has to be, one demographic versus another. And I'm like, no, it's everyone. So as the person who wrote and designed it, I want to ask you, since I have you right here in front of me virtually, how do you feel this should be used, at various levels? And what are the outcomes you hope to see from folks who have engaged the material?
Well, I hope that teachers will be able to be open enough to go on a learning journey on their own, that also consists of some unlearning as well.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that they are armed with tools and questions that they can ask, as well as their students can ask, of the information that they're looking at. I hope that they can then apply that information to situations outside of the classroom. So if not only if you're questioning the textbook that's in front of you, are you questioning that news article? Are you questioning that YouTube video about whatever it was that you were trying to learn about? And it doesn't mean question to not legitimize it. That doesn't mean question to, because questioning doesn't necessarily mean to remove it's being legitimate. It could mean for better understanding, or it could mean that, oh no, there's some holes here, but there's also some things we can hold on to as well. And so if we can offer a few more perspectives on something, how can you then ask better questions? At the very least, I hope the students and the teachers are are able to ask better questions of everything. And if you're asking better questions of history, then you're able to ask better questions of the present as well.
And that ultimately, beautifully articulated, is the goal of the work in my mind. Like, you have to deal with the past. James Baldwin said, not everything faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced, right? And so we have a lot of people in this moment wanting to face the reality of, you know, historic, systemic, institutional, personal, structural racism and sex, all the isms, right? Sexism, genderism, all that kind of stuff. The interesting thing is they want to do that just because they see the spectacle of it, right? I was saying, you know, the reason why we're jumping around with George Floyd's name is because we didn't see the spectacle of Breonna Taylor, right? Nobody, there's no webcam footage or whatever, cell phone footage of those police breaking into her house. And so George Floyd, the spectacle of that cop having his knee in George's neck is what rallies. It's the same thing that happened, you know, during the civil rights movement when America saw the dogs and the hoses being, you know, put on these young kids, right? But if we have better historic context for the why of what's going on now, then it helps us understand it in a way that hopefully allows us to have substantive conversations about how we create better tomorrows. And to your point about, you know, being vulnerable and unlearning things, you know, a lot of what we've been taught in America, at least in the last 50 years, has really been, I think, intentionally cultivated and curated so that we don't know how to ask these better questions. And that's why people get frustrated because they're like, hey, I gave money to Black Lives Matter. Why isn't it changing? Or, you know, even for Black males having issues with centering non-Black male leadership, right? Those are a lot of conversations I've been having. I'm like, I don't have a problem with it, but I get things that a lot of folks just haven't thought about because maybe they didn't know to ask those questions. You know, I hope that this work, the curriculum and the music, gets, I mean, there's a lot in here about that masculine feminine dynamic in the curriculum itself, that even if you're middle school and you're going through the change, as it were, right, it helps you go through that adolescent period with intention about who you are and how you identify and how you treat others who might not identify the way you do. Because in the African context, there's always been balance. We've always had balance between, you know, gender identifications. It was only when we got exposed to that, you know, toxic masculine patriarchal nature of Europe, Western Europe in particular, that those ideals and values shifted, you know. And of course there's patriarchy in African history. I'm not saying that that doesn't exist, but it looked different than it does in the current context. And asking those better questions and really getting to, you know, I think what's the core of the issues now so we can have a better future is my ultimate hope for the work.
And with that, what I hope as we're moving forward, and even with your new Reconstruction album, one thing I hope people begin to think about is not focus your time on Blackness only when it's grounded in pain.
Yeah.
And what does it look like to have a better understanding of Black stories that are grounded in joy, that are grounded in not just resilience to stay alive, but what does it look like to thrive in a healthy context? Like, what does that look like? And so if we can begin to see the curriculum as a jumping off point to not only understand some of the challenges, also resilience, and also ending in a better place, how can we start to think about what can Blackness begin to mean in something beyond what we've experienced? I talk about, I help folks understand things like equity, diversity, and inclusion, and those types of things. But our goal is to get to a place we've never been to, which is liberation.
Right.
Like, what does it mean to think about us in a liberatory space? And I mean us, not just Black people, but people.
Well, that's the most important part, right? Because in the American context, nobody's ever been free.
Exactly.
Except the people that were here before the first Europeans got here. They were the only folks that was free. You know, when the Puritans came over, when Europeans started, you know, settling on this land and raping the land and you know, committing genocide against First Nation folks, indigenous peoples, you know, that's when their freedom ended. And nobody's been free since. And so that's honestly how I end a lot of the conversations that I have, whether I'm giving a lecture or just talking about the work. And I say, well, if you trust the science based on mitochondrial DNA, we're all Africa. We are all Africa, not just Africans. We are Africa. Because Nkrumah said, you're not African because you were born in Africa. You're African because Africa is born in you, right? And so genetically, we are all one people. We just have to see that and then do the work to ensure that all of us are allowed to live our optimal selves as human beings. As you know, yeah. So we have to literally reconstruct human identity, which is why reconstruction is the next thing.
Oh, that's interesting. Thinking of reconstruction in a lot of different ways, like the actual time period, and then I see what you did there.
See what I'm doing? See?
Well, I thank you so much for asking me to be a part of this journey. It's been really exciting, as not only because I was able to kind of talk through some things that I knew, but also go on this learning journey. And I hope that not only teachers see this curriculum as helpful, but people who just want to learn in general. I've gotten emails about just parent groups coming together and having discussion groups with their children. Yeah. I think it's an opportunity for people to think through how are some other ways we can learn, especially in the midst of our current state of COVID and not quite sure if we're going to be back in a school building, but also thinking about how can we also be leaders in our own educational journey. So thank you.
Well, thank you for not looking at me crazy when I called you and said, hey, I have this idea, you know, and I feel like I call people last minute because I'm thinking about stuff for a long time and then I make a decision. It's like, let's do it tomorrow, you know. But I really do appreciate the time, the effort, and just the beautiful way in which you added a wonderful tool to this work. And I look forward to doing the same thing with maybe a longer timeline on the reconstruction.
Yes, give me more time, please.
You know what I'm saying? And thank you to the Wex for allowing us to have this conversation and share with the world. I hope you all check out the music at marklomaxii.com, and you can get the curriculum from Melissa at
mosaiceducationpress.com.
There
you can also find the Kindle version on Amazon as well.
That's right. It's officially official when it's on Kindle.
Officially official on Amazon.
I mean?
Right. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. All right.